Happy Friday, friends, and welcome back to the Sweet Tea series. My name is Ariana Silva. On this show, we interview women who decided to be the change that they want to see in the world. Today, not only has that woman definitely done that, we are also going to be talking about why we do these try to make these sorts of changes through policy, community involvement, and what it means to be American and fight for that sort of American dream. Caroline, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on, Ari.
So you are the campaign director for the Right on Healthcare initiative at TPPF. Mm-hmm. And we're not going to talk about healthcare at all today. And that's because another thing that you are is definitely. So actually someone the other day described you as bookish. And I thought that was such a funny but accurate description. I mean, look at we have some props today, don't we? But you're I don't know if you would consider yourself a historical expert, but you are a historical enthusiast, maybe?
Sure.
Yeah, and one of the things that you'll quickly learn about Caroline, especially if you spend any time with her, is her fascination with the founding of America, what the American philosophy is built on. And so today, especially for people who haven't had the time to think about that or haven't had a good civics education, I think it's a good opportunity to learn about that and actually ask the big question and kind of break that down. So let's start with the interview question that we have here. And someone always asks this if you're being interviewed at TBPF. What's the role of government?
Well, I think the role of government is to preserve the God-given rights of man, create the space for men to have liberty to pursue their highest end, the excellence of man, in community with each other.
Okay, and so how does that, well, of course, the American Constitution would then, the idea is that it defends that, protects the ability for that freedom. And then the other question, the thing that we're going to get into today is civics. So civic education, what does it mean to have studied that at all? So what is civics?
Well, civic education is important in every country because you need to be taught the history of your country. You need to be taught to love your country, defend her. But in America, because the people rule, we are in charge and have that self-governance is laid on our shoulders. It's so much more important because without an educated, virtuous populace, this whole project doesn't work. I mean, we have to maintain that good faith exploration of what the good of our country is, how we're going to work these things out, and this reasonable exploration of what is the truth. We have to be doing that together. And if we ever lose faith in our ability to find what is good for America, if we forget who we are and, fall to relativism or to kind of this tribalism, we've lost.
Mm-hmm. So let's even get back to the word itself just a little bit too, because you've said civics education, you explained why it's important, but what does the word civics mean, I guess?
Sure. Well, it comes from the Latin, right? For the city, the Kiwis is the people of the city, and we're all citizens, right? We have a stake in this thing. We have rights which are protected under the Constitution, and we also have obligations to this political community. One of which in America is participation and giving back to this country that has given us this very unique opportunity from a historical standpoint.
Do you see why I brought her on the show today?
Oh, I talk big, but...
Okay, so another important thing to trying to define our terms here when we're getting started. Are you subscribed to the Sweet Tea series on YouTube or on any podcast listening platform?
You know it. But listen, you guys didn't follow me back on Twitter. I just wanna point that out.
Did we not? Okay, in my defense, I'm not the one who runs Twitter.
Oh, okay, I'll
make sure that they're fired after this. Just to
send it up the line.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you are, and if you guys are interested in learning more about these things and these sorts of interesting conversations, this is the best way to start.
Subscribe, like, and share.
Thank you. So the other another cool thing about your interest in this sort of stuff, I think it even predates college, right? So
yeah.
I guess tell me about some of your interaction with your fascination with government even prior to that and your involvement with it.
Sure. So I I did classical education K through 12, so I was blessed with a very robust background in these ideas. But also, my parents are just good Americans. They're involved citizens. They brought us to a lot of volunteer opportunities. And one of the things that my mom was really good about training me in was remembering our civic obligations. So I can remember when I was in the Scouts in middle school, high school maybe, one of the service projects that I ran was running a Constitution Day fair. So we rented out, the public park, the Triangle in Dripping Springs, and we sat and gave out little pocket constitutions to people. We had a little Jeopardy style game where we were asking questions that are actually on the citizenship naturalization test, I think, to see, if natural
American
born citizens
know it.
Know it, right? And just kind of trying to share this love of what informs us as a political community, of these ideas that should be, like leading our thought. And honestly, it's sad how little people know. I mean, people have maybe seen I'm a Bill from Schoolhouse Rock, right? Which is good and accurate. No hate there. But they just don't have a sense that this is important, right? Like this is our founding charter. Like these are the principles that are intended to hold us together and guide our action in this state and in our lives. That was a very long-winded answer.
No, I think that's fantastic. Whose idea was it to do a Constitution Day sort of thing?
It was absolutely my idea, thank you, and not at all my mom's. Love you, Mom.
I think that's awesome. So, like, just being able to do that is what activated your interest in it.
Yeah. I mean, I had been doing these things. I loved my government classes. I was you learn in declaration statesmanship and reading these primary texts, and I really love digging into the history of where these ideas came from, why they were important, what is it intended to achieve, because you really do have to understand things like, what was the crisis at hand that they were trying to solve? What was the original public meaning of these words? What would this have meant to, the colonists on the day of the founders, this type of thing?
And that was because you said you had classical education is what it's called. I know the schools are popping up more and more now, thankfully, but can you explain a little bit of what defines classical education and how that's different than maybe someone else's K through 12 experience?
Sure. Well, there's a conversation about what particularly defines classical, and I by no means intend to be the arbitrator of that debate. But I think at a simple level, what's going to distinguish classical education from other types is that it takes a long view of history, really tries to place an emphasis on what we might call Western civilization, the great tradition, starting from the ancients as sources of reasoning and wisdom and truth that we should be, that should inform our view of human nature, and not necessarily starting as later, or as...
So you'd be you're talking about like Greek philosophers, right?
Sure, yeah. Like Plato and Aristotle is where you start, right? And you go to their voices, and you don't just present sort of abstracted scientific facts in a textbook with no sense of where these ideas came from, right?
So if you're learning about science, would you talk about the scientists who came up with those theories and how they got there?
I did.
That's awesome. I feel like that's definitely not the public school education that I had for high school. So when another
and your education certainly served you well. You have done well with it. I'm not by no means saying everyone should be like me. That would be bad.
There are times though that I do feel like I'm lacking, because I've had to, as an adult, really consciously seek out these things, which is a good thing to do and to always be learning. But it does feel sometimes like I don't have the same foundation to be able to build on. So, it's just something that I had to, like, in college, especially in later when I realized it was something that I was missing. I didn't even know I was missing it to begin with.
Sure.
And so it's had to take a very conscious effort to try to build that up. And thankfully, working like around people like you and other people here at the foundation has helped me do that. But I don't think that that's something that a lot of Americans even know they're missing to begin with.
Sure.
To try to seek that out.
You have to have the hunger. But once you have that, if you have the will as you do, that can sometimes be almost better than having it given to you with no appreciation for it.
That's fair.
I think that's something we need.
And one of the other things you were talking about with the importance of this and is the way that it protects the American idea and these freedoms that it's intended for. But whenever Americans, like you were saying, they're not interested in it, they don't know about it, that's probably very much connected to a lot of the problems that we're facing, and having women come on here to talk about how they're trying to solve. So what are some of those issues that can arise when people don't understand the purpose of the US government?
I mean, for one, we grow accustomed to the government not doing what it should be doing and doing things it should not be doing. These are kind of the two ends of it.
It's like, what's an example on either end then?
Sure. Yeah. So overactive regulation really is the biggest example of government doing things that it should not be doing. I talk a lot about the administrative state and kind of that bloat of bureaucracy, which not only is, I would argue, unconstitutional, but also just it has taken control over aspects of our life that the government was never really supposed to be involved in, and we've lost some sense of our personal and civic responsibility for these things as a result of that.
So let's talk about the bureaucratic state then, because I feel like a lot of times it's thrown out. You'll hear it on Fox News. You'll hear it whenever you have policy wonks talking about it. So what is the bureaucratic state, and why is that something that you think goes against, I guess, the original founding ideas of America?
Sure. I mean, it can be really abstract, when you think of the blob and you think of the unaccountability of bureaucrats. The bureaucratic state is also, your local government who has a good purpose and a cause and things that they do need to be there to do. But I mean, will sometimes try and tell you, oh, you can't use a gas-powered lawnmower in your own backyard, or, oh, you can't paint your house this color, or, we're going to regulate your speech in all of these ways. We're gonna infringe upon your private property rights in all of these ways.
And I think the other area that gets away from it is that a lot of times these are unelected officials.
Right, and that's the big thing, right? Because elections is how the American people express their will, and what they have hopefully reasonably determined among themselves is what is going to be best for governing their community. But if you can't retract someone through elections, you've lost the mechanism by which you convey your will to them, right?
Right. And I think another threatening piece of it that I didn't realize until more recently, and I think a lot of people got a wake-up call to this during COVID, is how much the bureaucratic state, well, first of all, these people are there for decades, right? So you think that you're turning over by electing people, but a lot of the same personnel are still working in the government and are even making policies that are impacting everyone else.
Sure.
So like I think during COVID, that was one of the big times where we saw people and actual laws or just regulations that you have to follow with penalties that are attached to them by agencies and people who aren't elected by individuals.
Sure. Yeah.
And so what are some of the, because the government is, facilitating those sorts of things and overreaching its boundaries, what are some of the duties that it neglects?
I mean, well, why are governments instituted among men? To protect our rights, to secure us as a nation. So, okay, let's talk about, we're not securing our border. Crime is rampant in most major cities, which means we don't have the rule of law. How can you even have rights if you don't have executive if you don't have people enforcing the laws, right? Sorry, I'm stumbling over my words here a little bit.
No, you're totally fine. I think that it shows, like, what you're saying for crime is that people who are committing crimes and not being, properly going through the criminal justice system, that leaves other people who are not able to exercise their rights as a result of that.
Exactly, yeah. And I mean, this is just shocking to me. I mean, it's like,
that's what your number one purpose. And I think the border security piece is a big one right now, where you can't have a nation that has those ideals if you don't have a nation, which requires borders and border protection and who those people are.
Exactly. You have to first exist as a political community before you can, as a community, determine what is best for you and your citizens.
Right. And so let's talk about then some of the solutions to try to fix this problem. So a lot of Americans, like we're talking about, aren't
secure the border.
So number one, secure the border. Watch our other episodes on that and look at what TPPF is doing to try to fix some of those things. But also, I think education is a big piece of that.
Absolutely.
So, like I'm saying, people don't know what they don't know. So, right now, I think one of a big thing that's happening in the conservative sphere is there's a lot of people who are criticizing public education in the collegiate level.
Sure.
Which I think is totally fair because my college, again, I think it fell short of providing that component of education.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that they might actually be conservatives might be going a little bit too far on their harsh criticisms of the university system and people getting liberal arts degrees even. So do you agree with that statement?
Yes and no. Let me say more about that. I think that insofar as the study of liberal arts is not what it ought to be, there is some valid criticism in that. I think if this were a straight toss-up between, in an ideal world where both functioned as they should, would trade school or something be better than liberal arts or something? And the answer is depends on your vocation. But also we've lost our belief that you can find the truth, which is what a liberal arts degree is intended to sort out. It's supposed to be a place where scientists seeking scientia, like true knowledge, right? Can think in this place that's been set aside for them and kind of foster this reasoning that we really need in America because we don't have a dictate from God or something that tells us what's good, right? We have religious freedom, which is a big thing. But we also have to actually believe in the truth and in its capacity to shape humans. And the university has lost its faith in that as the end.
Right, because what you're saying is that you need to believe that there's a truth to be found.
Yes.
And I think that even the classes that I've taken that were like on the liberal arts side of things, a lot of them were very relativistic.
Yes.
So many of them were. So what do you think is like some of the downsides to relativism?
I mean, it destroys the American project.
In what way?
Well, first of all, you lose your capacity to see the American founding as the best regime. And you have to believe that. I mean, like, this is our beautiful country. But also, I mean, the people rule, right? Which means we have to have a trust that this is our best shot at sorting out what's going to be best for us. It's not perfect. It hasn't always worked perfectly. It won't always work perfectly. But this is our best shot. And so we have to put everything into that. Right. By which I mean, like, we have to trust that when people elect their representatives, that they know what they want, that they're informed enough, this sort of thing. But if we don't believe that some things are better than others, that like there is someone who's better to elect over another, over some sort of like exertion of the will, you know, that like, oh, well, if they elected this person, they're just racist or whatever the tag word of the day is, which is sort of where we're leading, right? Then it's not going to work.
So what do you think sets America apart as a country, like from its founding? What are some of those principles that we're upholding that didn't exist prior to the founding of America?
Well, I'm not sure that I would say that they didn't exist.
Well, I guess that didn't exist enshrined in like they weren't existing in other countries insofar as they weren't enshrined in their law.
Yes. I mean, they exist like in the great tradition, right?
Well, what's the great tradition? Let's break down all the
that
the big
now
words.
that I am not equipped to say. Again, remember, I am just a fool. I by no means am the best representative of any of these ideas. I just love them.
Just an enthusiast.
Yes, indeed. But I will say, I think what sets the American founding apart, right, is that it was founded by bold, brave men and women who were seeking religious freedom, right? So they were seeking freedom of conscience to follow the moral truths that they held without the dictate of a magistrate. And they were seeking a reasonable country where both of these freedoms exist side by side. And you generally don't see that. And I think that that's such a great opportunity for friends of liberty, for friends of serious thought. And I think it can be done well if we continue seeking this excellence, right?
So what if people are saying like, that's a great thing, it's cool to learn about, but if I go study that, I'm not going to end up with a job. What are your thoughts about that?
I have two things. First of all, I have a job. Second of all, you don't have to study it. Um, um, I hate this idea of expertise, you know? We all should be lovers of liberty, lovers of the American tradition, and this should shape you as a person and as a citizen, no matter what your calling in your ordinary life is.
So it's what you're saying is that it's not just intended for the learning and becoming an expertise, but you think that it has other areas that it can help people?
So let me make that a little bit more concrete, because I'm way too abstract. You know this, Ari. You need to bring me down to earth a little bit. I obviously love liberal arts. I knew I wanted to pursue this path in higher education.
Actually, let's talk about that then. What did that path look like for you?
Say more. What do you mean?
So what did that path look like for you? How did you decide to go to the college that you went to? What was your experience like whenever you were there?
Sure. So I went to Hillsdale College, as you might recall, which is a wonderful private liberal arts education, deep in the heart of Southern Michigan. It's right there. And I did that because I loved the great tradition, and I wanted to continue deepening my ability to engage in this conversation. And my background really set me up with this idea of lifelong learning, that no matter what I ended up doing, and I knew I wanted to do politics, so it wasn't really a question for me, but no matter what I ended up doing, this hunger for further knowing would shape who I am. It's not even what I know, as if it's a list of facts, but it's who I am as a person who then goes out and engages with the world. And so even if I ended up in some other career, I mean, many lifetimes ago, I wanted to be in the fine arts, right? Which is not really a thinky job per se. It's closer almost to tactile, right? Because you're using skills. But even if I had done that, I would be the sort of person who tries to engage with the great tradition, who understands that like there are great thinkers who we should look to for these truths and that sort of thing. And I think that that's really important because it's not like, oh, I do liberal arts and then I get a liberal arts job. So
then how does it serve your job, for example?
It has made me a careful reader, a careful thinker. I strive, and this is hard because I got an ego, but I strive to remember that there's always more for me to learn, that I need to carefully attend to the arguments of those who I may be on the other side of the fence from. And yeah, I mean, I don't love the like liberal arts is for critical thinking type of argument. You may have heard this. Because I think it fails to recognize that there is an end which this is seeking as well. Like there are.
So it's not just for the thinking, because then that stops halfway. You have to ask, what is that thinking for?
Right, exactly. Because it's like you can think carefully and still reach the wrong conclusion. And obviously, as imperfect humans, we can never know the full truth this side of eternity. But there are better and worse. And I think we can say that. And so I try to be careful about saying, oh, it'll make you like a sharp thinker. But it will hone the skills that you need to get as close as you can to finding truths, right? And like, oh, what's better or worse? Do I think that, the city of wherever I live, I'm trying not to call anyone out, should be like putting out this regulation that bans short-term rentals? True story. Is that better or worse? We should be able to engage in reason and figure that out.
Right, and then be able to act on, here's what I believe to be true, and now I have something on which I can
Exactly.
Right.
It's not just like, I thought real carefully about this, so you can't tell me it's wrong.
In a way that I think, so Hillsdale, I think, does a good job of protecting what liberal arts is and is intended for, but let's say a liberal arts degree at any other university, lots of those in Texas, I think, fall short of that. But I think that part of that is because they're teaching ideology instead of philosophy, which is something that you brought to my attention. So can you explain what the difference is between ideology and philosophy?
Sure. I mean, I think it has to do with how you position yourself vis-a-vis the truth. And who you think the ultimate arbitrator of that is, right? The framework of ideology has a tendency to sort of reduce everything to like exertion of the will, you know, and you're like, oh well, that's the idea of these people, and not take into account the potential that some people might be closer to the truth than others.
And I think that what you said about philosophy that ideology doesn't do is that it sharpens human reason.
Yes. Yeah.
So what do you mean by that? Or I guess how does philosophy serve that?
I mean, philosophy comes, I mean, the Greek is like philosophia, right? Which is like lovers of wisdom. And I think that's really how you have to position yourself in this life, because I am a fool. I will never know the truth, right? But hopefully I'll get closer to it, right? And that's how I try and position myself. I think there's sort of a train of thought that thinks like you can know things for sure in a sort of factual way, in a like empirically verifiable way, which is true, and you do need that. I'm not like bashing the place of political knowledge, political science, but they're different things, and I think understanding that is important.
Right. And I think that something that you read are iterating a lot, that makes a lot of sense to me, is that whenever you put yourself in a position to seek truth, you're going to get a lot closer to it than if you're in a position where you don't even believe the truth exists.
Exactly. Yes. You said that so much better than me.
You know, it's only because of spending so much time with you, Caroline. So another thing that we've been able to do here at the foundation is try to course correct when people overstep the rule of government. And that's rolling. We're, thank goodness, have so many intelligent people who are able to try to reshape that. One of those things this year was the Death Star bill, which is a fantastic name. As a Star Wars fan, I'm absolutely loving that. So there's actually a Forbes article about it last year. And so I'm going to read a few quotes about it just to explain what that is and how it's gone into effect now. So someone was talking about local governments and the way that their overregulation is really impacting people who live in small communities. So someone said, the patchwork of regulations that currently exist in Texas makes it more difficult for a business to operate and create jobs, said Annie Spillman, Texas director for the National Freedom Federation of the Independent Business, which represents small businesses in the Texas legislature. And then she continues after that, the world's 9th largest economy shouldn't be subjected to the whims of rogue regulators who often pass onerous mandates in the dead of night. So I think that that's one of the issues that's facing small town communities, especially, and then also just local cities like Austin and other big ones that are
for sure
having that sort of regulation that impacts the way that they can live their lives. Or you like even mentioned the short-term rental thing that impacts something that has been a part of what all citizens of Texas were at one point able to do, and just part of what you can do with your own home. And then another quote from that article is, the compliance cost alone kills job, increases prices, and discourages innovation and growth, Quintero added. By the way, that's James Quintero from here at the foundation. The Regulatory Consistency Act brings some much-needed common sense to the system, unifying the rules for conducting business in a predictable, reliable, and efficient way to promote compliance. So basically, he's talking about this Death Star bill now act, and I think the idea of it is to help curb some of the oversteps that local governments are even making. Are you able to talk a little bit more about why something like this is important?
For sure. This is important from a practical standpoint because there are onerous local regulations that impact people's day-to-day life, as that article rightly notes. It's also really cool from a standpoint of principles, right? Because this is a preemptive act. It basically sets out a few sections, I believe it's 5 sections of code in the Texas state code. So this is statewide code, and says, look, guys being the cities, if something in these sections of code is covered at a statewide level, y'all can't regulate beyond that, right? Like, this is something that the state has made clear, and we're preempting you from regulating in those areas. And these are things that are that the legislators determined were important, right? That fall under the proper ends of the state government. And the state government, remember, this is like reverse federalism, okay? The cities didn't come together and make up the state, okay? The state made the cities. And so the cities have certain proper ends, right? They should be doing law enforcement. They should be doing roads. They should be doing, district courts and that sort of thing. They shouldn't be regulating what you can do with your private property.
Right. And one thing that I think people can mistakenly critique about this is that you're like, oh, well, it's giving too much power to the state and not enough to our local governments. It's better to be more local. But what this actually does is it creates like a way to localize governance even more back into the family. So it protects from that overgovernance from like it brings it into the even smaller government of the family.
Sure. Well, right, because you're correct. That is one of the counter arguments. You'll hear people push this idea of local control, which some things are better to be done at a local level, but you need to be asking yourself, is this something you should be doing in the first place?
Right.
Which I think it really is the issue at hand.
And I think a lot of people haven't been familiar with asking themselves that question of, does our government even have a right to be doing this in the first place? Do we, whenever something goes wrong, I think a lot of people are very quick to turn to the government as a solution to that.
Yeah.
Let's get back to like, where did that sort of thing even start? Because I don't think it's a new thing that's just happened in this century.
No, I mean, we definitely, as sort of progressivism and this idea of the welfare state grew up, we've lost our imagination for the capacity of civic life. I mean, Tocqueville's intermediate institutions, like local communities, bowling alone, whatever. There's a lot of different ways to interact with this idea. But the government just does too much, and we're used to turning to them for a response. I mean, I see this a lot in my area of healthcare. Government-run programs are not always the best way to fix a problem. There are times where some populations are best served by having a public safety net, but there are other times where that's not the best way to achieve that end, and people forget to even ask that question, no matter what, political tribe they may come from. Which is why I think it's important to get back to sort of these first principles and be saying, like, what are the rights we're trying to preserve here? What is the best way to like govern in this situation?
And you're reading a few books about that right now, right? About like progressivism. So what are some that you're reading?
Christopher Caldwell is at the top of my, underneath only the Gabriel Garcia Marquez on my reading stack. And he's the book is called The Age of Entitlement, which I think he's talking about the cultural revolutions and civil rights issues sort of in the 60s, which is later than progressivism. But this is some of this like cultural change of kind of a loss of personal responsibility, civic responsibility, very much individualism being treated in a different way. And I'm all for individualism as the founders understood it, toward excellence, but not just sort of like blindly asserting itself, right? And as you start building out these things, expecting the government to do more and more for you in areas where they had never ventured before, that becomes a problem as you become used to relying on them and less on, your neighbors, your family, your church, whoever it may be.
Right. So by over trusting the government, it's also then like made people that just not used to relying on their neighbors, like you're saying.
Right. Yeah.
So let's talk about the idea of progressivism then, the thing that continues to advance this mission. Are you reading something else on that right now?
I am. I mean, I've been going back to, this is actually a collection of primary sources. I love primary sources. Hillsdale taught me to love this. It's edited by Dr. Pastrito, who's the dean of the grad school at Hillsdale. So kind of cool guy. He's scary though. I never took any of his classes. But I mean, progressivism in my mind kind of starts with Theodore Roosevelt, kind of what some might call the populist movement, which I think is a little deceptive, honestly, because it's shrouded in a lot of language about moral uplift and giving control to the people. trying to protect against evil big business and all of these awful elites and this sort of thing, which very much resonated with people at the time, I think. But the, sort of practical policy solutions that emerged from this are a much stronger executive, much weaker state parties, and an increasingly bloated administrative state as the executive started suddenly shooting out all of these weird little, agencies and things.
Yeah.
Right, which, I mean, again, it's unconstitutional, guys. Like, legislative non-delegation doctrine, like, this isn't even really... The executive has no particular power over it. It's a big problem. And it's doing more than it should be. And, I mean, the other side of this, right, is that progressivism is too ambitious in the ends that it ascribes to government, right? So, I mean, some people will say the American founding, like, lowered the ends of government, insofar as it took the realm of revelation or of men's souls out of the realm of government, right? No more state churches. Which may be more or less true. But the founding couldn't lower the ends of man. Like, we can still, if we don't lose sight of human excellence and, like, people can be good and noble and virtuous, if we don't lose sight of that, the ends of man are still there. But progressivism somehow was like, no, we can have man perfected scientifically, and we can have government perfected scientifically, and, efficacy and progress, and just sort of this machine-like
we can create a perfect system that everyone falls into and becomes perfect.
And guys, guess what? Checks and balances, so last year. Like, we've outgrown the need for that. Administrative bureaucracy will do it so much more efficiently.
So how far back does that date, that progressive idea then?
Turn of the century, just about, is where you start seeing it. Which, I mean, it's sort of tied into the Industrial Revolution, I would say.
So turn of 1900s.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Wrong century.
not 1999, but 1899. Yeah.
And that's, so this is nothing that's new, but something that rather seems to be, like, I guess it progressed to this point, if you will.
You could say.
So what do you mean by that there's no actual ends to it then?
Ends to?
Progressivism.
Oh, well, I mean, it's just always eating itself.
So I guess, like, let's say how it impacts how people speak, for example.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the example I was making to you earlier, right? It was like this idea of there's always some new PC phrase of the day, and 10 years ago, there were cultural, I'm not going to get granular, but, like, there were cultural ideas, phrases, and things that even, for instance, then President Obama was not okay with that have now been pushed to the point where you're a bad person if you don't accept these ideas. Because there's no sense of eternal truths, I would almost say, which is what, like, the great tradition would tell you is, like,
that
some things are always true, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, yeah, these truths are going to be reflected differently in different times, but not. I mean, there's really very few historical things that are going to change. There are no historical things which will change human nature. And there are very few which will significantly change the way you see human nature, I would say. Which is something that progressivism just misunderstands. They sort of said to themselves, we have shiny new technology, and therefore humans are not, like, fallen anymore.
So they believe in a perfection that I think conservatism automatically admits is not attainable.
Yeah.
So whereas conservatism is how can we make this the best that we can, emphasis on that we can, versus progressivism is no, we need to make this perfect and stomp out anything else that doesn't adhere to that.
And there's no forgiveness. This is like how there's no sense that, like, we're never going to be perfect about racism or any of these other things. Cancel culture, I think, is a pretty good expression of this.
Right. That's true. And I guess I hadn't made that connection before, that if you think that there is such a thing as human perfection, then you can be a lot more strict on people if they fall short of that, versus if you believe that people have a fallen nature, then there's forgiveness and redemption and more growth that you can have within that sort of idea. So I think we've only been able to dance around and touch just a little bit on the ideas of like what government is for and the importance of civics education. So let's say there is someone who's inspired by this and wants to learn more. What are some resources that you would suggest to them?
I would go to the primary sources, frankly. I mean, read some of the Federalist Papers. Like, go back, read the Declaration of Independence.
Do you have a Federalist paper that you'd recommend to people to start with?
10 is always a good one. 10 is about factions and how the democratic institutions kind of play around with this.
Right. Also, sorry, let's ask even the more basic question. What are the Federalist Papers, Caroline?
Come to my reading club and find out. No. So the Federalist Papers are constitutional debates, essentially. Because remember, our first charter really was the it's not the Articles of Confederation. I'm a moron.
That's what I was about to say too. So that
but we basically had like much stronger states who all were like coining their own money and doing their own defense and all of these sorts of things, and it really just wasn't working. And so they put forth the Constitution. Some people weren't fully on board, and so the Federalist Papers were anonymously published newspaper editorials, basically.
Op-eds, basically?
Yeah, op-eds. I was going to say op-eds, but I was like, well, it's an argument, though. Put forth by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison, arguing for this is why we think this Constitution that we're proposing is the best that we can do, given, all of these circumstances and such. Making a defense for it, right?
So Federalist 10 is a great place to start, you're saying.
It is.
Are there any podcasts or any books that you recommend to people who just want to start learning about this?
I mean, I'm always faithful to my alma mater, so I will say, if you go to online.hillsdale.edu, we have free online courses that cover a lot of these founding principles taught by our faculty. We have Constitution 101, we have Constitution 201, we have early progressivism, a lot of cool stuff on there. Which kind of deals with these primary sources, the people who were putting forth these ideas and why they're still important for us today. Like, why do we even need to be thinking about this?
Right. So I think that's a great place to leave people for where to learn things. And one more thing that I want to give just as a piece of inspiration. So right now, you and I are the same age. So you're 24 and you are directing a campaign here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. How do you think that, or what are some of the things that have helped you get to this point in your career this early on in your life?
Good mentors.
Really? So who, like, in what way have they mentored you that has been helpful?
I mean that's a big question to tackle. I'll say,
are there any people who gave you like a piece of advice that really stuck with you to get here?
Sure. I mean, I have learned a lot from my supervisors here, frankly. I mean, TPPF does great work, really pours a lot into their people. I think just trying to flourish where you're put is how I really try and approach everything in my life, is like take the opportunities that are given to you and do as much with them as you can. I'm not an expert on any of these things that I've talked about, but I try with every little piece of knowledge that I'm afforded to do as much with it as I can. I haven't lived much life. I've read a few books, but that's really about it. But it's possible to read books and not grow yourself from that. It's possible to read books and think that it makes you more than perhaps you are. And I think just that sort of...
Finding a balance with that?
Well, no, like intellectual humility, which, okay, Caroline, you're not humble, but I know I should be. Like, I have a sense of this is what I'm striving toward, and I'm going to do as much with everything I get as I can. So that's kind of how I approach it. I really think a lot of it has just been given to me, honestly. Great
and then you have to make the most with those opportunities.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's fantastic. So thank you so much for sharing a lot of this overview that I could not have done on my own.
Completely incomprehensible, but...
So if people want to hear more about your opinions, where can they find you?
You should follow me on Twitter at CWelton, WELTON 76.
And by this time this episode's air, this episode airs, you guys can check and see if we're following Caroline finally. Thank you so much for coming on the show. For everyone here again, so as you said, you can look at Hillsdale for resources. And of course, if you want to learn more about what's happening in Texas, what it is that what's going wrong so that way you know how to get engaged, go to texaspublicpolicy.com, and we'll see you next Friday.